Well, here we are. Welcome to OverDrive. Jim, Tatti, Frankie, Corrado, and Dave Feschuk. And nothing going on today. Absolutely nothing.
No guy?
Nothing going on. Laine traded.
Oh, great.
How about that?
Host of Montreal. Going back the other way is Jordan Harrison, a second-round 2026 draft pick. So the business of the NHL grinds on, my friend.
Well, it's picking up now. Like it's been quiet for long enough. We get the offer sheets, we get the captaincy change, and now Montreal's doing some business with Columbus. I wonder if this is the OverDrive bump. Like Donnie Waddell was on the show last week talking about how Laine does not want to go back to Columbus. So he's got to find a way to get a deal done, and he had a couple teams engaged, and turns out one of those teams was the Montreal Canadiens. So he's off to Montreal.
What do you guys make of this? Because if I'm a Montreal Canadiens fan, I got some real second thoughts about this.
I'm thrilled.
It just
Dave.
happened.
I'm thrilled.
For the Canadiens?
If I'm a Canadiens fan, I'm pumped about this.
Okay.
Okay. You
Wow.
gotta give
so you
me,
and I are on opposite sides of the spectrum.
Okay, give me your reasons first.
Well, he's Patrik Laine, okay? He spent this season, much of it in the player assistance program,
Mm-hmm.
okay? He was cleared to play in the wake of the player assistance program, 3 weeks ago? He also had a clavicle injury. He's had multiple injuries of late. This is a guy who peaked in his second season in the league, and he just finished his 8th season in the league, and it's been nothing but underachievement for most of the past 5 seasons. So you're getting a distressed asset, and you can either look at it like Marty St. Louis is going to be the guy that changes the career arc of Patrik Laine, or you could look at it as he's going to go to a city where the media and fans are merciless in their critiques of people with great potential that do not live up to it, and it's going to get worse. And if I had to pick one of those two outcomes, I'm going to pick the second.
Okay, it's a valid argument. I think there's a lot of validity to everything you just said. I think for starting with the market, if there was ever a time for a player like this to go to that kind of market, this would be the time. Because there's not like playoff expectations on this team. Like there's not, I don't know, they're not holding them to, you have to be a 90, 95 point team, and if you don't, it's a big disappointment. Like it's not a free pass, but it is a little bit of it's a transition period in that organization. So it's not a bad time for a guy like that to, maybe it's a little undercover for him being there. You give up Jordan Harris, who there's quite a logjam on defense now because Lane Hudson's there. Logan Mayhew's going to try and make the team. David Reinbacker's going to make the team. And you've also acquired a second-round pick for this. So, like, as far as, the assets that you moved each way, it's a good deal in that way for Montreal. The Marty St. Louis thing I find interesting. I think that's going to be his calling card as a coach, is how do you get your fingerprints on a player because you were the guy, you were a player, you were in these rooms not too long ago, you're a great communicator, you can be hands-on with these guys. Is that your X factor? And I think to this point, the Slavkovsky progression last year, Nick Suzuki kind of blossoming into a legit number one center on that team, Cole Caulfield and his development, all those young defensemen there, like, I think a lot of that has to do with Marty. So with everything going on, not the high expectations, a good opportunity for Laine to just kind of play his game and, maybe fly under the radar a little bit. And Marty being able to get his fingerprints on him, it's a good of a time as ever for a guy like Patrik Laine to be there. He's just got to stay healthy. Like last year was obviously a write-off. The 2 prior seasons, he's right around a point per game in the 50, 55 game range. But he gets hurt, and he's done.
Right.
If he plays an 82-game season, is he getting you 80 points?
Well, that's the question, right, Tatman?
Yeah, so, where do you have him slotted in? You do these games. You do the Habs, so their forward units. Where would you put him?
He'd be on the second line. That's where he'd be. The first line you're not going to touch. It's Suzuki, it's Caulfield, it's Slavkovsky. That line was really good, and they deserve to stay together. The second line is where you're probably going to have, hopefully you have healthy Kirby Dach. That's going to be an X factor for them because he hasn't played much over the last couple of years. I think 2 years ago he played 50-something games. Last year he only played 2. He had the torn ACL. They need Kirby Dach. Alex Newhook was a good acquisition for them. Even he missed some time last year. So I think he probably ends up playing with Dach and Newhook on the second line. And then from there, you got to fill in the rest of your roster. But it's a good, it's a transition transitional time for the Montreal Canadiens. So that makes it, for me, that makes it a good time as ever to try Patrik Laine there.
Well, the problem with that, Frankie, and look, don't misconstrue what I'm saying here. I pull for guys like this. It's wonderful to see talent. And, you remember those early days when the Leafs would go into Winnipeg and there was real buzz around the Matthews-Laine matchup, right? And there were some great moments in that matchup. And there's no doubt Laine has talent. But the guys you mentioned there that St. Louis has been doing a great job with, like the Caulfields and the Slafkovskys and on down that list, Suzuki. Those guys are model young guys who, by all accounts, work pretty darn hard. They're doing all the right things. This guy's the exact opposite of that. This is an older guy who's been doing all the wrong things or a lot of the wrong things, and it hasn't been going his way. So, look, I don't doubt that Marty St. Louis seen plenty of teammates of that ilk, been around the league as long as anybody, and maybe there is a reclamation project there, but why would you bring a reclamation project in, a guy that has had health problems, clearly discipline problems? Why do you bring that guy into the mix of a young team that you're trying to develop? It kind of reminds me of different guy, different type of character, because everybody's different. But why did the Leafs move Phil Kessel out with his, kind of legendarily less than fastidious work habits? It was because they had a young team. Brendan Shanahan made that decision to move him out. He didn't want that kind of influence on his young team. The Canadiens are bringing in a guy who I'm not sure is the best influence on young guys. He may or may not be, but his track record suggests to me that he would be a guy I wouldn't want my young guys learning from.
Well, so he's got 2 years left on his deal, right? It's $8.7 million. There's no salary retention. So that's why you get the sweetener, the second round pick. I think for Montreal, they probably have a 2-year window here where they're still not going to be pushing up the standings. So it's still a 2-year kind of transition period. Like Armia's coming off the books next year. Gallagher, Anderson, those guys are all coming off in 2 years. Now you can add Laine coming off in 2 years. Once all that money is off their books, then it's time to spend. Then it's time to say, okay, we're trying to climb the Atlantic. We're going to compete or try and compete with Toronto, Boston, Tampa, Florida, and whoever else is in the mix at that point. But I feel like in 2 years, if Marty St. Louis can connect with this guy and find a way to get him to, give a little more, away from the puck, defensively, whatever, just be a little more engaged, then it's worthwhile. I do think it's worthwhile, given that they're not trying to push up the standings yet. It is still like a transition period.
Yeah, but what's your take though on the whole idea? Like I've heard many a sports executive really fret and express concern about the influences they subject their young developing players to. Right?
Maybe he was subjected to some influences though when he was young. You know what I mean? Like I think sometimes.
So he's going to be the mentor now. Patrik Laine is going to be the mentor. That would be wonderful.
I don't know if he's going to be the mentor. I know in Columbus he brought in Adam Fantilli, and Adam Fantilli lived with him. Like I'm sure if Fantilli's representation and the team didn't want him around the guy, they wouldn't have had him live with the guy. You know what I mean? Like there's something to be said there. I think Patrik Laine has had a reputation based on bringing video games on the road in Winnipeg as a young player, instead of the older guys in Winnipeg grabbing a hold of him and saying, hey, bud, let's go out to dinner. We'll tell you how we do things in the NHL. Instead, they just tried to bury you know what I mean? Like, I think when you're a young player, you need the guidance.
Yeah.
Not everyone goes to the NHL, especially as an 18-year-old, ready to just be an adult and an NHLer in the traditional way of things. Like sometimes you need a little bit of a mentorship personality in your life, and maybe he didn't have that, and maybe that's why he's kind of gone down this path. Maybe Patrik Laine was failed along the way.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. You bring up some good points there. And look, when it all comes down to it, there's one thing you can't deny. Like when he has been healthy, when he has been on the ice, it's a short list of guys that can score like Patrik Laine. I was just, you look it up over the past 8 years, and he came in the same draft as Matthews. We all know that. It's of the guys who've played at least 400 games, he's 17th on that list in goals per game, 0.43 goals per game. It's 35 goal pace. And that's kind of coming in and out of injury and some years of late that have been marred by a player assistance program stint, some extracurricular stuff you wouldn't want on your resume. So he can score, but I think there's a lot of question marks here. I don't quite understand why you bring this guy into a young, impressionable, developing team, and I think the jury's going to be out on that one for quite some time.
So Laine in a second round for Jordan Harris. My only concern would be he comes in at 8.7 and they're paying the full freight. He's the highest paid player in the team.
Well, I mean, they didn't sign that contract, right?
I know, but
their cap structure is going to be different because Suzuki's always going to make the most there for the time being, and Slav is going to be right there, and Caulfield. But
those guys have 4 years apiece, Caulfield and Suzuki. So that, I mean, then this contract runs 2 more years. There are general managers that wouldn't touch that.
That's for sure.
Just because of the dollar figure right there at 8.7.
But they had the room, and they obviously have a need for a scoring winger. And like Dave said, as far as this guy goes, he scores at a really high clip, and if he can stay healthy, he can help that team.
They feel they need offense and maybe power play time. Well, certainly power play time. My question would be sort of a broader question for you: is there are people that can score in the league, but for the most part, if you don't play the other end of the rink, you don't have a future anymore.
That's Marty's job. That's his job, is to try and find a way. He doesn't have to turn him to a Selke candidate. He just has to get him to play the way they play in Montreal, like skate away from the puck, finish a check every once in a while. Make sure you have your guy in the defensive zone. I don't think they're going to ask too much from him. They're not going to try and, fit a square peg into a round hole. They just want him to be goal-scoring Patrik Laine, who plays with the same kind of competitive edge that the rest of the team is going to try and play with. And that team, if you watch them play last year, they're competitive. They lost a lot of games, but they lost a lot of, 3-2, 4-2. It was close. They gave you a good game most of the time, Montreal. And that's going to have to continue for them. And he's going to have to find a way to fit into that category where it is competitive. And I think that's where, the shadow of Marty St. Louis and the way he played and the way he tries to instill that competitiveness in his team, that needs to shine through. And we're going to have to see that from Patrik Laine. But I do believe this is a worthwhile bet, a worthwhile gamble for that team. Considering where they're at, considering who the coach is, and considering what his track record is, if you're not going to do this now, you're probably never going to do something like this. So the time was right to do it.
The debate will rage on. Coming up in the broadcast today, David Naylor at 5:05 talking about Chad Kelly's return to the CFL and the Toronto Argonauts, and that will happen Thursday night at home to Saskatchewan at BMO Field. Later on, we'll have Yes Guy, No Guy at 5:30, JP Ricciardi at 6:05, at 6:30, NFL analyst Michael Lombardi, and coming up at the bottom of the hour, Carter Hutton, former NHL goaltender, will be with us to talk about the other hockey news of the day as well as the Laine trade, and that would be the Oilers moving out salary to perhaps match what St. Louis did to them the other day.
That's some maneuvering, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it had to happen, and it was right on time.
Yeah, I don't know where you guys... I'm still not sold on which direction they're going to go with this. I kind of think with the Ceci trade, Broberg has to be coming back. They're going to match that one, or else why do you move Cody Ceci? But it's either Broberg is back or both of them are back. I don't envision a world where it's just Holloway now because you make the trade with Vancouver to bring in Vasily Podkolzin.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, I think before those transactions happened, I thought it was more likely that Holloway was retained and Broberg was moved out because, frankly, twice as expensive, right? It's simple math. I mean, and
who's the better player right now? Holloway's the better player.
Holloway's
right
been
now.
the guy they've used more. I mean, he played in all 25 playoff games.
Yeah.
He brings them an element of speed on the wing that I think they don't really have in abundance. And so I think he was, to me, seemed like the no-brainer, a more reasonable deal that you don't feel uncomfortable about, and B, a more proven player. And yet, there's another school of thought, Frankie, that says you always err on the side of keeping the young D, right?
I think that's ultimately where they're going to land. When a D-man is, a guy you draft that high, skates well, can move the puck well, has a bright future, he might not be there right now, but do you want to know what he turns into in 2 years somewhere else? And then he turns into a top 4 guy and he didn't do it under your roof? I don't know. I feel like that's probably the way they end up going, where they're like, if this guy's going to turn into a legit, minute munching guy with some offensive upside and who's pretty strong defensively, he's going to do it in our organization, and we're gonna see that through. We're not going to let St. Louis see that through.
Problem is, like, the minute you sign that deal and match the offer, you've overpaid him. Like
100%.
You've overpaid him.
Dave, no one gets to play a show me year at $4.5 million. You play like a prove it kind of year on your qualifying offer or $1 million. You don't get to prove it at $4.6 million, but this is what St. Louis jammed him up. And now he's going to have to prove himself at $4.6 million. Yeah,
and we all know the backstory there of there seems to be a consensus in the hockey world that St. Louis never would have done this if Kenny Holland still was the general manager of the Edmonton Oilers. Of course, Doug Armstrong, GM in St. Louis, very close friends with Kenny Holland. It does feel like there's a very strange dynamic on the undercurrent of this offer sheet situation. But like, Frankie, when you overpay a kid like Broberg, to me, and it's completely an organizational failure. Like, it may well be Kenny Holland's failure for not re-upping both those young players proactively. He could have done it. There was opportunities to do it, and it wasn't done. But the organizational mistake in this offer sheet, to me, it could put Broberg in a really bad spot where he can't live up to that salary. He can't live up to the minutes and the role you would associate with that salary, and it could hurt his development.
Yeah,
if it already hasn't been hurt.
Well, okay, here in Toronto, how many times did Kyle throw a young player a 2 or 3 year deal at like $850,000? Like, I'm thinking of the Joseph Wall one, right? Mm-hmm. Relatively unknown player, hadn't played that much at the time, but here you go. Take a 3-year one-way deal. Why do you do that? To protect yourself from situations like this. It's like, worst case scenario, at least the guy's locked up and you're not open to this. Now, at some point, I remember being that young guy who's in the American Hockey League who's like, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure when I'm going to get called up. I don't know what my next contract looks like. If the team came to me and said, hey, you know what? We just want to have a little security here. Why don't we do a 2 or 3 year deal? We'll get it done for $950,000. Calling my agent and I'm saying, okay, send the paperwork through because I'll take that and I'll know I have some financial security, even though I don't necessarily have the security of where I'm going to be, AHL, NHL. Why wouldn't you do that at some point, just as some general housekeeping? Like, is that really going to sink you, having those players locked up? Probably not. Probably a good bet, actually. And now you're not faced with a situation like this where if you match, you got to pay this guy the second most or third most on your back end. And you got the Evan Bouchard deal coming up.
That's right.
That's a lot of money.
You got a lot of headaches there. And I do not envy Stan Bowman's first month on the job.
Well, I know, but you have to be aware of these things. I mean, it slipped through the cracks. There's no question about that.
It does seem to have slipped through the cracks.
And talk about pressure, oh so close to a Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
That you really can't afford to fumble.
Well, and now if Broberg comes back, he's playing top 4. Like, there's no sheltering a guy at $4.6 million.
But see, that's where I have a problem. Like, you start casting him on the depth chart, not because of his ability, but because of his salary. And that's where you run into problems.
Yeah, it happens all the time when you sign a bad deal.
Yeah.
Except this time they're going to be forced to do it. Like, when that happens somewhere else, it's like, okay, you signed a UFA that doesn't work. You'll try and dispose of it. But if not, you got a bad deal and some bad money on the books. And at first, you play that guy high up in the lineup because he's a new shiny toy and you want to see if it works. And if it doesn't, okay, it doesn't work. With this situation, you were forced to do this. Like, in no way, shape, or form were they ever going to go that high with this player.
No.
Like, if they could have got him to swallow a qualifying offer, that's exactly where they wanted to be. Under $1 million. Go prove it. Now he's got to prove it at a lot more money.
Well, and this is the thing. Like, it's such a strange dynamic, right? Because, you can blame Doug Armstrong and the St. Louis Blues for jamming up the Edmonton Oilers. But guess what? Philip Broberg was complicit in that. Philip Broberg agreed to sign the offer sheet.
100%.
Right? So
when there's that much money at play, though, how do you not sign it?
Well, you can't not sign it, but you can't not sign it. I'm not condemning him for signing it, but I am, you have to be aware that you could be thrust into a situation where you're miscast as a second pairing guy. You're going to get those minutes.
Yeah.
You're either going to sink or swim. If you sink, life will be very uncomfortable.
Listen, if I sink, I'll count the fact that I made $9 million over the last 2 years guaranteed, and I wasn't making $800,000 because I could very well sink and make $900,000. You know what I mean? Like, and no one's gonna feel bad for the guy either way. But you have to look after your financial security as a player, and that's what everyone's doing.
But there has to be a reason. I mean, here's a guy who was expecting to be re-signed by Edmonton and didn't happen. We don't know what happened there, but I mean, the agent turns around and offers his services around, which he can. I mean, that doesn't happen out of nowhere. There's a driving force that phones somebody up and says, "Are you interested?" Because nothing's happening here. I mean, nobody's innocent here.
Oh, this is a great move by Broberg's agent, Darren Ferris. I mean, this is serving your client. This is finding a way to say, hey, we're gonna get you some money here.
When you don't have arbitration rights as a player, and I've been there, you're at the mercy of the team. And you look around the league, and a guy like Broberg would probably say, well, okay, who are his comparables? It's tough to know because he's been in the American Hockey League a little bit, but probably looks at a guy like Liljegren. He looks at that Boqvist defenseman who was in Columbus. Probably looks at Rasmus Sandin to a maybe a lesser extent because Rasmus has been in the league quite a long time. He's like, those guys are making somewhere between $2.5 to $4.5 million. And you guys, you want to stick me with a qualifying offer because I have no leverage. Well, guess what? The agent went out and got leverage. And now the guy's going to get his money. And I think that's a little bit of a cautionary tale for teams that, have players that are RFAs that don't have arbitration rights and say, you know what, we're going to jam a qualifying offer right down your throat and you got no choice. Well, guess what? Now salary cap's going up. So teams have a little more money to spend, and that's going to alleviate some of the pressure. And maybe there's not so much of a gentleman's agreement between some of the general managers. And there you go. We get a summer with a couple qualifying offers, which is not something we typically see.
It's a lot of fun.
Well, so the ultimate question comes out of this is if you're sitting in Edmonton and you're looking at your blue line, which to me was an emerging story, got better as the playoffs went on. Is it good enough? Is it better than the one that finished the season?
Is it better? I don't know. I don't know if it's better or worse. It feels like it's very much the same. Like, who's out the door? Cody Ceci's out the door. And who's in the door? It's like Josh Brown is in the door. That's just a depth guy. Vinny Desharnais is out the door. That's a depth guy. Like, it feels like you're going to try and replace, Ceci with Broberg, the full-time version, the top four version. Yeah, and he's got to be like Cody Ceci, for whatever he lacked at times, was dependable. I think he only missed 10 games as an Edmonton Oiler his whole time there. Like, when he was at his best, he was pretty simple. He was fairly physical. Like, there was, you could rely on Cody Ceci. Maybe not the biggest upside. And that's where Philip Broberg comes into play because he has a much higher upside. He's just young. He's 23. He hasn't hit it
yet.
Well,
that's the thing here, though. Like, there's an old school way of thinking, guys, that you don't really know what you have in an NHL defenseman until you sometimes hear it 300 games, I've heard.
I hate that saying.
Well, yeah. How many did you play?
I didn't get 300. Okay. I was on roster for like 250 maybe.
Okay, so that's why you hate it. I understand.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a terrible saying.
No, I was like,
terrible saying.
I was like, everyone gets these 200 games. I said,
sorry.
I'm just watching them.
I'm not poking you, Frankie. I'm not joking. It wasn't a direct shot at Frankie Corrado's career.
I take significant umbrage with that saying.
Okay, well, you can take umbrage. I'm just going to tell you, it's been repeated by many a hockey man over the years. Take it for what you will. Maybe it's not 300. Maybe let's say it's 250. Okay, if you've been on roster for 250,
there we go.
We can tell you what you have in this guy. Philip Broberg has played precisely 81 NHL games.
Well, guess what? He's got to step up now. He's being paid for it. Yeah. The roster spot has been created with no Ceci. It's there. So if he doesn't do it, he's out.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough spot for the Oilers. Like, it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't in a lot of ways. Like, if you let him walk, you got a real hole.
I just think you would look at it and figure out where you would project Broberg and where you would project Ceci over the next 2 years.
If you kept Ceci today and let Broberg go, that doesn't do anything to your Stanley Cup chances this year. But down the road, you will regret not knowing what Broberg could have turned into under your roof.
Yeah, it's more than you want to spend, but it's worth it, isn't it?
We'll see.
We're going to find out. I don't think it's not. It's that, you can't say it's worth it in the here and now. He may grow into the worth.
Well, yeah, but he stepped into 4.5 because somebody didn't take care of business. I mean,
He wasn't even in the lineup for a lot of the playoff games.
There's risk for St. Louis, too. St. Louis could have signed that Broberg to $4.6 million. He goes there, and he's still an AHL defenseman, and it's all kinds of issues. And guess what? What good did it do you?
So the bottom line is,
it goes both ways.
Sometime tomorrow morning, I think around 9, they have to make the decision. So any time from now until 9 in the morning, the Oilers will have to say yes guy or no guy.
Oh, God. Are they allowed to do that, guy?
Well, I'm going to waive it for them.
All right.
Yeah, that's what has to happen, right?
Okay, guy.
Does it make any sense? Of course it does. Coming up next, we'll talk with Carter Hutton from SiriusXM, former NHL goaltender, right here on OverDrive. You're listening on TSN 1050, the iHeartRadio app, streaming online and watching on TSN 2. Oh, yes, guy, OverDrive on a Monday. Jim, Tatti, Frankie, Corrado, and Dave Feschuk with you to kick off we got off to a busy start with the Laine trade to Montreal. We have a poll up on our OverDrive X account. How should the Blue Jays front office handle the Bo Bichette situation? And the options are explore trade options, sign him long-term, or see how 2025 plays out. What do you think?
Well, you can try and sign him long-term, but what if he doesn't want to stay? You might have to explore trade options. Like, you can throw all the money you want at this guy. It might just come down to he does not want to be a Toronto Blue Jay. So what do you do in that situation? Better get something for him.
Yeah.
Look, man, exploring trade options.
That's part
in the wake of a bad season, disastrous season, an injury-riddled season. You're just selling low, guys, right?
You are.
And I'm not comfortable doing that. I think you got to just play it out. You see if you can, you can have discussions about a discount deal. He's not taking a discount deal. It's the guy who's led, the majors and hits a couple of seasons. So it's going to be tough.
So we got into this a bit. Should I do that, Doogie? Should I read that liner there? Okay. So this is something to chew on. It's brought to you by Boston Pizza, Canada's favorite sports bar. Summer is short, so make sure you make it to make the most of the patio season at BP. Join us for a long lunch or a late night. So see you for a pint on the patio soon. Boston Pizza. This gets into the Laine situation. You draft a talented individual, and you're obligated to make that work out, in my opinion. We've got examples on each team in Toronto. Every team has these guys. These are premium players that are drafted. And to me, it's on the front office to build around this guy, to support the player, to make sure it works. Because if you're going down the road of, now we got to trade him, you have failed. And the odds of you getting equal value for that asset are not good. This is on a front office, isn't it?
100% this is. That's exact. Like, this guy should have been in the category of he's here for life. And, for one reason or another, team underachieved, not a great team that's been assembled. And it's like, now the guy's basically made up his mind. And I don't know how you change it. Like, I don't know what you would do to change this guy's mind in 1 year.
It's a tough situation. You only get so many foundational players, right? Like to come through your system. And if you do not capitalize, if you do not make it work, it's very difficult. Heck, we just heard Chris Bassett, Blue Jays pitcher, on this Chris Rose rotation podcast, talking about how if you want to be a major league contender, you need 3 or 4 star players. Right?
Absolutely.
Let alone the 2 the Blue Jays have.
Well, but a lot of teams do that. Here are the 2 guys, and they're going to carry us. Well, guess what? They're not going to carry you. They need support. Just plug in your favorite team.
And this season is a case in point of why they need support, because not every year is going to be roses. We've seen Vladdy have down years. Now we're seeing Bo Bichette have a down year. And if you don't have the infrastructure and the depth in your organization, it's going to be very difficult.
We're going to return to this because there's a lot more to be said. Let's deal with the hockey story of the day. Laine going to Montreal and the offer sheets that St. Louis has put in on Edmonton players and what happens there. Let's bring in Carter Hutton now, SiriusXM NHL Radio, Daily Faceoff Hockey analyst, former NHL goaltender. Carter, welcome. How are you today, sir? What do you think of the Laine deal?
I like it. I think for him, it's a reset. Obviously, it's exciting times, I think, probably for him and his family in the sense of, the way things have gone for him, these last few years and some of his struggles off the rink. So it might be a reset, but in the same sense, I think it's a lot of pressure too. You're going to a market where they're going to expect him to be back into it. So it's going to be exciting to see how this one plays out.
That Montreal market, like everything is Habs. Live and breathe Habs. If you've ever spent any time there, like you've probably gone out for dinner there on the road, Carter, and been in a restaurant and they have that 5 to 7 show on where they're talking about the Habs for 2 hours. And you probably sat there thinking, man, like they talk about the Habs a lot here. But I made the point to these guys earlier. If there was ever a right time for a player like this to go to the Montreal Canadiens, now's probably the time. They don't have playoff expectations. They got a coach in Marty St. Louis who's kind of, his calling card is going to be developing these guys and maybe dealing with a reclamation project like this. Like, is this the right time for them to take a gamble on Patrik Laine?
I think so, right? He adds some depth. He can have some scoring. And he's a guy that I think, they have pride, right? Just getting a chance to get back in there. But, for me from the outside looking in, I think about my career, like starting in Nashville and how fortunate I was to be able to kind of be protected by Pekka Rinne, protected by a fan base like this, where now Patrik Laine's had a career where he can be a bit of a leader too for this team, right? He can go in, help out. And I like the idea that they're still in this rebuild. It's kind of a flyer. It's not the end of the world if it doesn't work out, but in the same sense, they could be looking really smart here come, mid-season when they start to make a push. Because at times last year, even though they didn't really perform up to par, the Montreal Canadiens were a tough team to play against, and they were in a ton of one-goal games. And I look for them to take another step forward here, especially between the pipes with Montembeault, having a real good starting year last year.
Carter, what about the potential downsides here? Like, this is a guy who's just coming out of the player assistance program. We know the injury struggles he's endured the past handful of years. We all know he can score, but there's also clearly downside here. He's on his third franchise despite his obvious skill. Like, what's your level of trepidation that you got to be careful here? Like, he could be a negative influence on your young group if you're not careful.
Yeah, I think they obviously do their due diligence on this as well, too, right? So for me, off the ice in Montreal can be risky as well. I think Frankie can probably touch on that a bit. Like, this is a different world playing there. I remember one time doing a rookie party in Montreal, and it was like we were the kings of the city, right? I didn't even play in Montreal at that point. So being a Hab and being the pressure and what comes with it off the rink, you need to be able to, draw lines in the sand and understand like you're there to play hockey. And for him, there's going to be that temptation. There's a lot that comes with it. But again, I guess I'm a believer in the process, right? You trust the rehabilitation program and everything that they've dealt with. And for Laine, I think for him, he's come out and been pretty vocal about it, which I think is the first step. And at the same time for him, he is a talented hockey player. He's always had that knock of being lazy and not being able to, get the job done. But I also think with guys like Martin St. Louis, Trevor Letowski, guys that have played in the league, players are be able to help him a lot in Montreal.
The other thing, it comes to a point, I think, when you're a highly skilled player where you realize it might be your last chance. And if it doesn't work here, you might not get another opportunity somewhere else. Like, maybe that's something that goes into Patrik Laine's mindset this year where he's like, okay, it is a fresh start, but it's also my last chance. So I have to be super diligent and dialed in on everything I do. And if Marty St. Louis tells me I got to back check or if I got to make a hit here, that's just what I got to do. And it's a non-negotiable.
Yeah, for me, it really hits home when I played with Mike Ribeiro, a guy who struggled in Montreal with, on and off the ice issues, came to Nashville. We had that leadership group, we talk about Pekka Rinne, Shea Weber, Mike Fisher. Yes, I don't think the Montreal Canadiens have that in that sense, but a guy like Martin St. Louis is a leader, someone that can get him to buy in. And when we had Mike Ribeiro in Nashville, he was unbelievable. And I think the Habs are building that culture, and it's one of those things where I think Laine can fall in line and actually bring some value to this team and help some young guys. This is a player who, he's had success in the league. It's just a matter of getting back up on that horse for him.
Carter, the other big issue around the league, and we're still waiting to see the outcome, is the double-barreled offer sheets fired across the bow by St. Louis over to Edmonton. We've seen the Cody Ceci trade to San Jose. We've seen the Oilers acquiring Podkolzin. What do you make of it? How do you think it's going to end up at the end of the day tomorrow morning?
I think it's going to be at least one of the guys, right? I think they make room with CC coming through. And I also like to move by Doug Armstrong, right? He's put the succession plan in place with Alex Steen, a former teammate of mine, a guy that was, at the time didn't wear the C for our team, but was the captain and was a really big leader. And I think for him, they're trying to take a chance at this to get some players that, showed a lot of value come playoff time, right? That I think in their contracts were undervalued. So the Oilers are definitely going to be in a situation where I think they don't want to lose them, especially for just a second round pick. But at the same time, they're kind of backs against the wall here with money and some decisions to make. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes. It's one of those things I think it's surprising it doesn't happen more often because, the hardest part for the team is the fact that you put in all this time and all this effort and you watch these players groom into who they can be, and then they come in like this and sweep them up under the rug. So I think Edmonton has a tough decision to make, but I assume you'll see at least one of them staying there for sure.
So, I mean, after the smoke clears, Edmonton's so close to a Stanley Cup win last year. How do you assess this blue line with Broberg in it and Ceci out if, in fact, that's what happens?
He's a more mobile defenseman, right? I think that is the interesting topic here is the fact that Ceci's gone, who's a little bit more of a bigger body. And I think for them, they're going to have Darnell Nurse play a lot better than he did during the Stanley Cup final there. He obviously took a step back. And I think with Evan Bouchard and his mobility and the way Broberg can play, those two can be a lethal weapon. But I worry about the defensive side of the puck, right? This is a team that I think, years past, we always questioned how they could defend and how well they were going to. Where last year, Knobloch really had this team buying into playing better defense, especially once he got in and was able to kind of get all his ducks in a row with the defensive squad. So it'll be a big year, and I'd like to see him take a step forward. And I think for this team, you have Leon Draisaitl and you have Connor McDavid. They're always going to be a threat to be back in that Cup final.
So big news here in Toronto. I guess it was last week or the week before. Is Auston Matthews is now the captain. John Tavares is not the captain anymore. Maybe just your kind of experiences with different captains that you've played with and how much of an impact, someone wearing the C can have in a dressing room and on the ice.
Yeah, and I touched on that earlier about Alex Steen. I think times there's leaders, even if they're not wearing a C or a letter, there's experience, but there's also the fact that Auston Matthews is one of the best players in the world and deserves the right to wear that C. What I loved is the fact that John Tavares supported it. Everybody was on board. And I think it just, kind of galvanizes that team in the sense of, we're going for this. We support Auston and we want him to take the next step in his maturity of becoming a leader on the rink. And, for me, this is a team. I got a chance to skate a lot with Matt Murray this year here in Thunder Bay, and he looks great. They have depth in different positions. They've added a few key pieces, I think, to maybe shore up that back end. So I think it's an exciting time for the Toronto Maple Leafs. I know there's always that black cloud that hangs over them come playoff time, but, things are looking up here, and it should be a great start to the year.
Carter, goaltending, big news in Nashville. We got the Yaroslav Askarov is sort of in a bit of a limbo, I guess you would say, with the Predators signing Saros to the long-term deal. They've brought in veteran Scott Wedgwood, and there's also this buzz going around the league that Askarov does not want to go to the minors, would not be interested in reporting to the AHL, sees himself as an NHL goaltender. Therefore, there's trades in the winds. What do you make of this situation with Askarov and the Predators?
Honestly, it gets me a little fired up, right? I know he's a big prospect and I know he's good, but the same sense, like there is a plan there. I think UC Saros being signed to that long-term contract really hurt Askarov and his chances of getting up right away. But I also think there's a plan here. You look at Nashville, I was kind of going through, I'm seventh all time in games played for the Nashville Predators with 75 games, which isn't a lot when you really come to think of it. It's because they've done such a good job with goaltending. You look at Volkun, 113 games played in the minors. Pekka-Rinne, 145 games played in the minors. Saros, 52. Like, they know what they're doing here. And this is a guy, like, you have Barry Trotz, you have Mitch Korn's back there. They're going to set the table for this kid to have success, right? I just think it's a little early for me to jump the gun, right? Askarov only has 92 games played and a .911 save percentage. And for me, there's some other goalies in the league. You talk about Linus Ullmark, Thatcher Demko, guys who've played over 100 games in the minors, and they took 3 years in the minors, and now you look at them. Demko, probably a future Vezina winner. Ullmark, already a Vezina winner. So it takes time and maturity, and I think there's just that little bit of rush. I just don't love that it went public right away. I think there's a chance for him to play some games this year. Wedgwood's a good goalie, but, there's usually lots of injuries. I think last year we almost ended up over 100 goalies. So for me, I think it's hitting the panic button a little early, but at the same time, this is the new culture, right? Guys are skilled and they want to play right away.
Well, and I think, the Saros deal gets done, and it's hard to expect the team to do anything different. Like, that's the guy, that's been the guy. He's one of the best goalies in the league every year. But I think if you're Askarov and you see the Wedgwood deal come through, you're like, what are we doing now? Because that's a guy who's an NHL goalie. Like, that's probably not a guy who's going down to the minors. So I just wonder is that the one that he looks at and says, okay, check, please, I'm out of here.
Yeah, but I think from a management standpoint, Frankie, you got to be knowing they need the depth too, right? Knowing the fact of if they do lose Saros, if they do have that, especially when they just went and added 3 big studs in Shea, in Stamkos, and up front with Marchessault. So these are guys that they're trying to make a push now. And now all of a sudden, I think you want to have that depth. I understand his take on it, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was still to see games. I just don't love the public announcement of it, where I feel like this is stuff that can go on behind closed doors. But at the same time, I understand where he's at, but 2 years in the playoffs, losing his crease in the Calder Cup. So he's a guy that really needs to take a step forward, because the NHL is a big jump for him.
Carter, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for having me on, guys.
That's Carter Hutton, former NHL goaltender, now works with SiriusXM, and also, where else does he work? Daily Faceoff Hockey analyst.
Yes, guy.
Yeah, well done.
Yeah.
So there's the ultimate challenge when you're in the front office. You draft properly, and then you have to help them mature properly. Not easily done.
You have to, like, drafting is one thing. Developing is another thing. Like, sometimes they don't just go hand in hand. Sometimes teams draft really good players and they don't find a way to facilitate, their development along the way. And, guys fall off. This is a goalie who's obviously very confident in himself and his abilities and thinks should be in the NHL. I have a hard time faulting that kind of confidence. Like, I wish I had that kind of confidence when I played, to be honest with you. But at the same time, you have to have realistic expectations, and you have to be willing to put in the grind, because Team X that's looking at him is probably salivating over the skill set, but they're probably not thrilled about the guy being, very public about what he wants and how he wants it.
Yeah, that definitely is a red flag, right? You got to be very careful around a guy that doesn't want to take the guidance of a franchise that has a pretty good reputation in developing goaltenders, as Carter points out, right? Like, you look at their murderer's row of goaltenders. Just like it's pretty impressive. They got Vaucoon to Rene to Saros. It's been a good run, and as Carter pointed out, all those guys spent time in the minors. There's some wisdom to spending time in the minors. As much as the pay is not very good, and maybe the buses aren't as nice as the planes, and the whatever Holiday Inn Express isn't as nice as the Four Seasons. Grand scheme of your career, you'd like to see someone in this young guy's ear saying, this might be good for you, pal.
Well, and it might be good for him, but probably a first-time experience. These guys are really good performers and used to being the star of the show, and to sort of backtrack. I mean, I'm not surprised that a young athlete would want to push the envelope and get to things faster. They should. They should want to do that.
They should want to. You just have to accept the grind along the way. Like, I think sometimes teams purposely put you in these situations to see how you react to it. You willing to grind, or you just want everything right away?
Well, we'll see. Yeah. Coming up next, we're going to talk about a few things, and there's plenty of meat on this bone. No question about that. And at the top of the hour, Dave Naylor will stop by and talk about Chad Kelly returning to the Argonauts, and that'll happen maybe Thursday night. They haven't said who's going to start that game against Saskatchewan at BMO Field, as the X is now open. This is OverDrive on TSN 1050, the iHeartRadio app, streaming online, and also watching on TSN 2. Oh, yes, guy, OverDrive. Jim, Tatti, Frankie Corrado, and Dave Feschuk. OverDrive is brought to you by FanDuel, bringing you everything from the opening line to the final score. So we're going to have Dave Naylor on talking about Chad Kelly at the top of the hour. In the meantime, Nathan Rourke debuted as a BC Lion last night. He was 8 of 25, 126 yards, 2 interceptions. Winnipeg wins the game 20-11. Winnipeg has played BC in back-to-back games separated by a bye week for the Bombers. And in that time, they shut out BC 7 quarters in a row. And Nathan Rourke at the end of the game, not too happy with himself.
I want to take this moment to publicly apologize. That was not my best football right there. As a quarterback here, it's never a one-person job, but it is the position where you have the ball in your hands every single play. And I didn't make enough plays. I know that I'm better than this. I'm sorry to the team who stuck their necks out for me, for getting me here and allowing me to play. The rest of my teammates effort is never going to be an issue with this locker room. They fought right until the end. I'm sorry to the fans. I know there was a lot of excitement going in this game, and I didn't deliver. I'm going to be making sure that if this is the starting point, then we only got up to go from here.
I mean, that's a guy who's carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, because he's been pursuing his NFL dream for a while now, and he comes back to the CFL, and it didn't go the way it went for him when he was back here the previous time.
Yeah.
But Nathan Rourke, very, very talented. That's a tough situation for him. Like, he didn't have much practice time. He's got to play the Bombers his first game back. He's been playing the NFL game for a long time now. Like, that, he's not going to have more performances like that. He's going to get back to his kind of all-star caliber very soon. I wouldn't be surprised if it's next week.
Well, that's the point Dave Naylor was making on the show last week, guys, is that as good as this guy is, and we know how electric Nathan Rourke can be.
The best.
He can be the best quarterback in this league. He may well be the best quarterback in this league as we speak. He hasn't played football in a game in an awfully long time. He's been getting these little spot moments in training camps where he's been getting the runaround from NFL teams. He spent last season trying to break into the NFL. Didn't happen. And so he's rusty. It's as simple as that, guys. You got to give him some time here. He's got to get his reps. Unfortunately for the BC Lions, it might be at the expense of some losses. And that's the calculation they're going to have to make here, because it is a very strange dynamic that Rourke has supplanted the guy who was in the running to be the most outstanding player in the CFL in Vernon Adams Jr.
I think that just speaks to how highly we see Nathan Rourke, right? And how good he is. And I think that one thing he mentions there is, they really made a push to bring him back there. He doesn't want to let anyone down. Of course he doesn't. He was just pursuing an NFL dream, but I have no doubt, a few more reps, a little more practice, gets familiar with the Canadian game again, it's going to be right back to where he left off.
And for whatever reason, they decide to jam him back into action. I'm never a big fan of guy shows up and 3 days later he's your starting guy and leading the franchise. I'd like to see a little more patience there. And maybe the Argos will do that with Chad Kelly. We'll find out when David Naylor joins us and you on Overdrive on TSN 2, TSN 1050.